will be in Genesis chapter 1 once again. Or again, not once again. Let's read just verses 1 and 2. I don't think there's any need to read further than that for our purposes today. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, or empty, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Why don't we pray then and seek God's help in understanding and in taking from this text all that we're supposed to take. Jared, would you pray?
Father, we ask you just that you would help us to take what we should from this text, that it would be helpful for us, that it would be something that we can hold on to, Lord, in our Christian lives, and that we might be able to see Genesis the way we should, the way you meant us to, Lord, and that these things that we study in this series and even today would benefit us for the rest of our lives, Lord. I just want to pray that you would give us open minds, that we would have clarity, that you give Chad clarity of speech as he teaches through these things, that you keep the children quiet and calm, and that they may even be able to glean something from it, Lord, that you keep their minds open. Lord, I also want to pray for the Shallers, just as they're not able to be here, that you help them, that you just cause them to start to feel better, that they could be able to even meet as a family, as they're looking at having some sermons in the home this morning, Piper or something like that. And I just pray that you would meet with them and that you would help them and just give them the strength, Lord, today. And may it be a blessing even kind of in disguise with sickness, Lord. Bless them. Again, help us here. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Well, it might seem like an odd text from which to say this, but I really hope, it's my aim that you would leave here, having listened to the things that are said today, kind of more encouraged in God, not just, yep, that's what happened, but actually encouraged with something that's in the picture here, or the picture that's presented to us here of the way God begins in creation, that you'd find it strengthening to your own walk as a Christian, and helpful in that way. Now, how we get there, bear with me a little bit. We will get there. It's not all that's going on in this text. There's some things that need to be said besides just some encouraging truths that we find, but we will get there. The last two times I spoke, we were considering the meaning and the significance of what we find in Genesis 1, verse 1. Today, I want us to consider what is in verse 2 and to glean what we can from that. So if you think of all that we did the last 2 weeks that I spoke for Genesis 1:1, we're going to do that same kind of thing all together, Genesis 1:2. Next time, then, Lord willing, we'll consider what the whole of Genesis 1 tells us about the Trinity, because it comes up here in this verse, or at least we kind of read it into there, or we see it there, we see evidence of it, and I just thought it'd be good just kind of to deal with that next time. So the phrases, if you've had questions about or you've asked about, let us make man in our own image, And then later, so God created man in His own image, in the image of God He created him, male and female He created them. We'll be talking about those things next time. But for today, let me give you just a brief outline of today's message. First of all, we'll consider the structure of verse 2. We'll just consider how it's broken down and how its various parts. Then secondly, the second part of the message will be what I call a blank slate polemic, or a blank slate argument. Then third is to talk about a cause for thanksgiving, that this verse gives us, a cause for thanksgiving. And then fourth, what does it mean the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters? So those four things. So the structure of verse 2, this blank slate polemic, a cause for thanksgiving, and then what does it mean the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters? So first of all, the structure of verse 2, let's just look briefly at it. There are essentially three descriptions of the scene, or three phrases. The earth was without form and void. That's number one. Number two, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And then number three, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So I want to briefly explain all three of those, before we move on. So first of all, the earth was without form and void, or tohu vabohu in the Hebrew, unformed, unfilled. As we have already argued for, we're not speaking here strictly about the earth. If you're to think about the universe, what we might call the heavens, and what Genesis 1, part of what Genesis 1 describes as the heavens, all that's out there and above us. If you think of the stars and the sun and the moon and those kinds of things as the heavens, and in contrast to that, you think of this physical earth that we walk on, you've kind of missed it, that here, the earth as being described here is rather the entire earthly realm, or the whole physical realm, which is our habitat. It's in this place that, right, the waters are divided, and you have the expanse, and in the expanse are the sun and moon and stars. It's this whole physical thing, this physical realm, that is the earth of verse 1 and verse 2. The earth was without form and void. So you might think of all physical matter, everything was without form and was void, empty. The phrase is saying that this realm was without form, without function, without inhabitant. In verse 1, God brought this material into existence, and now we're seeing that as of yet it is without form, function, or inhabitant. It's formless, it's empty. Then we read, darkness was over the face of the deep. The second phrase, darkness was over the face of the deep. It's a phrase really neck deep in controversy. You might think, well, what could be controversial about this? Without delving into the fray too much, let me just briefly list it for you so that you're not ignorant of it. When you confront a skeptic and they start saying these things, you don't think, well, I never heard of that before, that you would have at least heard it and known that there are real reasons for rejecting it. Darkness was over the face of the deep. Again, without getting too much into it, let me say at the outset that among real Christians, there's a growing return to the traditional view, which would be probably most of you the only view you know, that it just means darkness was over the face of deep water, and that's about all it means. And even many non-believing Bible scholars are kind of coming off what has been a popular accusation of the word deep. The Hebrew word bears a questionable connection to a Babylonian word, Tiamat, which, the connection is becoming increasingly questioned. The idea has been that there is in this word, deep, a thinly veiled reference to the Babylonian goddess of chaos, Tiamat. And so these guys will say, see, here's another indicator, another evidence that the Bible just kind of borrowing from these myths and these pagan ideas and just trying to, have their own God version of it. And sometimes they're really good and very coy at editing things, and other times they're just sloppy and it's obvious to see what they did and they're just buffoons. And so this is kind of, these are the arguments that are made, and this one comes in this way, that It's kind of a thinly veiled reference to this Babylonian goddess Tiamat, who was hostile to order and to the will of the God who created the world. In that version, in their version, the Babylonian version of creation. She was one of three gods of the watery chaos, which was a realm in which she lived. She ruled that realm with the other two gods. She's the mother of all the gods of order. So she lives in the in the realm of chaos and the watery chaos. She's the goddess of chaos, along with two other gods. And her and one of those other gods procreated and formed all these offspring, which are gods of order. The gods of order wanted order, and so they created a war with the gods of chaos, and Tiamat was slain, and she died, and her body was split up and divided into everything that we see today. And not all of it, because one of the other gods their blood was made men. So it's just this weird, bizarre kind of thing. But this is, that sounds strange and ridiculous to us, but people believed this. And if you want to know how much people believe this kind of thing, they sacrificed to these gods they believed in order to make things happen in the world in which they lived. It wasn't just kind of a fanciful story that, maybe that's how that happened. They actually believed it, invested in it, sacrificed their children because they believed it. And so this is a big thing. And the Bible comes in and argues against those things. Anyway, so this is the other view. And people look at this word deep in the Hebrew Bible and think there's maybe a connection. The result of all this is that some have said that the material in the verse is borrowed from other cultures, it's poorly put together. Now, all of that argument, again, we could spend weeks just delving into it, and it's tedious. And on some level, it's necessary. I mean, I'm glad I did the study. I don't think you need to do the study unless you're just interested. But I'll say this, all of that kind of idea is dismissed with full warrant by many. But again, if you ever go talking with someone who's a real skeptic about this portion of Genesis, I don't want you to have never heard of such a thing. The reality is that this phrase bears almost no resemblance to the Hebrew tehom. This tehom is the Hebrew word for the deep, and then Tiamat is the Babylonian word for this goddess of chaos. The phrase that we have in our Bible, "and darkness was over the face of the deep," is intended to convey several thoughts to us. If it's not a reference to this pagan god or something, what does it mean? Well, I think a couple things. First, we are to know, what is it communicating to us? We're to know and to take from this text, from this description, that part of the ominous nature of the earthly realm at this stage is darkness. It's sheer darkness. There's no form there, right? The earth is without form, but the formlessness of the earth is increased to our perception by the fact that there's no light with which we could discern its formlessness anyway. If this thing was just formless and there was light on it, you could say, oh, what is that? But it's dark, you can't see anything even. And that's a bit ominous and foreboding to us. Right? We look at that and think, I don't want to be there. But there's this formless, it's empty of inhabitant, it's just formless, it has no function, no purpose, it just exists, and there's no light with which to see it. That's one thing it's meant to convey. Second, the only form we would recognize, as we use the form a little bit different. They would say, use the word form and tie it to form and function. It has a form because it serves a function. That's why it has this form. We look at form and we think, solid, liquid, or gas. Because of modern science, we think of form differently. If you had eyes to see if there was light there to see, the form you would recognize was the deep, because it says the deep. It's just a sea, and it's just there. And it's not doing anything, it's just there. There's nothing to it. There's just a watery mass, but nothing that serves any kind of function. Now then, this third phrase, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. This is that third phrase in the verse, and we'll look at it in a little more detail later on in the message. But for now, I just want to say that this phrase I think, highlights for us the uniqueness of God as the author, the initiator, and the source of everything that is made in this whole creation. Let's just suppose for a minute that verse 3 changed gears, and instead of saying, "and God said," said something like, "and Billy said." It doesn't say that, but let's just stop for a second. What we have at this point in verse 2 is that there's an actor here. Okay, you have in verse 1, the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then the earth in that condition, having just been created, was without form and void. Darkness was over the face of the deep. But what happens? The Spirit of God was hovering over, brooding over the face of the waters. There's an activity. God's doing something here. So whatever else happens, this kind of happened first. There's something that was going on before God spoke. Namely, He was hovering, brooding over the face of the waters. That's significant. That tells me that whatever else happens in the story, everything's got some kind of a source back here in God. Not only did He create all of this stuff, but then He's somehow stirring it up and doing something with it before He speaks. So have that in your mind. There's activity before "and God said." God's doing something in this verse. There's a verb for God, present tense. He was acting. So that's what I mean by this phrase highlights for us the uniqueness of God as the author and the initiator and the source of everything that's made in the whole creation. Even if somebody else came in and did everything else, that person would owe their work to His preparation. He did something prior to what they did. Now the reality is there's no other actor in this chapter but God. The idea here is that everything was still and was dark like a great deep sea, and it was calm. And there was no form to any of it, and there was no life of any kind. And then everything being in that condition, God came personally and was brooding over and hovering over His creation. And then that third phrase then, this phrase, finishes out the setting for the narrative which follows. So you're to have in your mind just this great sea of nothingness when you can't see anything or anything, and all of a sudden, if you were there as a witness, you just kind of sense God coming in some way, and things begin to happen. Nothing distinct, there's no command yet, you still can't tell anything what's going on, but there's some kind of an activity, there's God's doing something. He's manifested Himself over the face of the waters. And then God speaks. And so you're prepared to see there's action that's about to happen. So this is the setting, and then the curtain unfolds, and this is what you see, and then the first actor, namely God, speaks in verse 3. The first line. Now then, so that's just kind of a breakdown of the structure and what we find in verse 2. Let's move on then. This blank slate polemic. What do I mean? Well, all of this that we've looked at so far gets us somewhere rather profound, I think, as we are thinking of Moses writing to the Israelites. It is what I'm calling this blank slate polemic. The idea is that the Bible presents us with a conception of creation that's absolutely opposed to every other worldview that existed then and that exists now. And this opposition to other worldviews comes first in the way that the preordered universe is described. It's not yet ordered and formed and put into all these and everything that we recognize today, but how is that preordered universe described? The Babylonians described it as there's a sea of chaos ruled by these gods who don't get along, and then some of them get together and have offspring, and then there's a great war, and then her dead body. That's preordered creation according to them. The Bible comes in with a totally different view. God speaks it all, and it's just there, still quiet, doing nothing. And then God comes, and all of a sudden He speaks, and there's activity, and there's order, and there's form and function and inhabitants. And so it's a tremendous contrast. And so the way the Bible presents that contrast is by this blank slate. It just says, look, there was no form. There was no inhabitant. There was no one there, and there was nothing there. It was just God and then just this sea of nothingness, just stuff that will later make up the earth. That's what He made, and that's the condition it's in before He speaks. It's not the pre-ordered universe does not consist of warring gods, but is merely still, indistinct, it's empty, it's dark, it's like a sea. The primary phrase in this verse concerning the condition of the earthly realm, there are three phrases in this verse, right? Formless and void, darkness is over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters does not describe the earthly realm itself. It describes something happening in that earthly realm. There's two phrases left that describe the earthly realm. One says darkness was over the face of the deep. That's more kind of a condition of it, like it was just really dark. That's part of it. But then most fundamentally, it was without form and it was empty. And we know that darkness was over the face of the deep is kind of a secondary clause, and formlessness and emptiness is the main point to get. How do we know that? Because it was not darkness and darkness and emptiness that come up. I'll say it again. It was not darkness and the deep that comes up again and again throughout this narrative. Rather, it's these two ideas, without form and without inhabitant. Those two ideas frame and shape the description of creation that follows in the chapter. First, God forms for 3 days, then He fills with inhabitants for 3 days. Those are the ideas that make up that form the rest of the chapter. The days are built on that structure. There's this problem. It's without form and it's without inhabitant. And all of this results, all this forming and filling that God does, it results later in a situation that He evaluates as very good. So think of this. At the beginning you have no form, no filling. At the end you have all the forms that we have, and it's filled with everything that we have, and God says that's very good. Which means then that no form and no inhabitants is not good. Right? God takes this situation, there's no form, there's no inhabitants, He gives it form, He gives it inhabitants, and then He says this is very good. That's the plot of chapter 1. You might say that the formless and void nature of the earthly realm at this point is not good. But what would that mean? What do you mean it's not good if we were to say that? That the goodness that's found later in the chapter is not there now. It does not mean it's evil or that it's opposed to God. After all, God brought it into existence, and it always does His bidding. It means simply that at this stage, the earth is not a suitable theater for the divine glory that God intends to display through His creative work. It's not yet ready for Him to do what He wants to do. That glory that He wants to display will require a creation that itself is capable and able to display God's manifest goodness, His creativity, His power, His eternal existence, all of that. Everything, this formlessness needs to take the form that communicates those truths about God to inhabitants that fill that place. It will also require a creature made in God's own image, in relationship with Him, ruling in His name throughout His creation. That's what God has in mind. And until He forms this thing and fills it the way He wants, He can't do what He wants to do. So this formless and void description is the primary point of emphasis concerning the condition of the earthly realm, all by itself. It's formless and it's empty. That's the main point. Now the thing to notice then is that God is beginning with a blank slate. It's just totally empty. It's void. It's formless. It's not got a previous form that someone else gave it. It's not got scars from some kind of a battle. It's not that kind of a thing. The chalkboard is clean, brand new, no previous markings. It's a blank slate. There are no marks left on it by anyone else. It's a watery wasteland, void of inhabitants or even anything that we would recognize as a functional form. There's no tempest or storm. There is no opposing gods. There's no will that God needs to conquer. There's no opposite will of His. It's just a blank slate. And if we're to use that chalkboard analogy again, what we see at the end of this verse, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, is like the artist, the craftsman. He comes, he steps up to the chalkboard, sets down his tools, and prepares for work. And we're left waiting to see what he'll do, what he'll make. There's only one actor here. Everything else is just a blank slate. Again, we have in this verse a description of creation. Apart from God's further command, it's empty, it's barren, it's dark, it's non-distinct, it's unordered material. That's all it is. It's like a wood pile. And He's going to take it and frame it and form it, and then He's going to fill it. And this is profound. Think of this, one of the first things the Bible tells us about God is that He takes disorder and barrenness and He brings order and life and beauty. That's incredible. I mean, the scene as we have it is just disorder and barrenness, and God brings order and life and beauty, and He brings that which is truly good to that situation. That's incredibly encouraging. The Bible comes and it opposes every other idea that men have about our habitation, about where we live and how it got here and all that. The Bible says that we live in a place that is ordered and upheld by one single Creator God, the only God who ever was and ever will be. That's the message, the point. In this scene, there are no other gods, not a God to defeat or to divide, no God to delegate to, no controversy among divine persons. There's no book of magic which God used to powerfully form all of this into its present shape. No forces to be driven back and overcome. There's perfect stillness. Nothing happening at all. The only activity at all in this verse is that which belongs to God. Matter, right? I mean, we could say, what's the relevance for us today in terms of worldviews? I mean, matter doesn't organize itself. It doesn't come together. It doesn't do anything. It just sits there until God comes and begins to move upon the face of the waters. And even that's not enough. He's got to speak and create and act and command. That's profound. The same image, the same message that Moses gave that confronted their worldviews confronts ours in a totally different way, but it still confronts the folly of man. Now, what about this text is a cause for thanks? Well, there may be many things, but here's one thing that struck me. As encouraging as this description is, and I alluded to this before, something about this description absolutely terrifies us, if we're honest. I mean, it's without form, without inhabitant. There was an enveloping darkness over everything, and the deep is merely described by the darkness on its face. There's nothing comfortable about that. None of us want to say, I wish I was there. I wish that's where I lived. Like, I don't want to, nothing about that appeals to me. The effect this description has upon us then should cause us to thank God. We cannot say that God would ever leave anything in this state. That doesn't seem to be the God that we know. But that's not the point. The point is that such a world as this, as described in this verse, can be conceived of by God and can be made by God and can exist and be upheld by Him. And there are observers to God even in this world, right? He made the unseen heavens. There are heavenly beings. There's a realm and there's a theater for His glory here. How thankful we can be that God further acted upon this creation. He could have stopped. He could have held off. He can think of a creation like this and make a creation like this and leave it like that. That could be the earthly realm. But everything we experience that's different than this description is owing to God's further plan, His further intention, His further will. It's owing to His sustaining power, to His goodness. What a cause of thanks. We already know it, but it's just, we already know God made everything and we're thankful to Him for the things He made, but it's helpful to think He could have made it radically otherwise. And here's a situation where it was radically otherwise. And God made the choice and the decision and performed the activity to change it further and to make it into what it is, or what He wanted it to be. How thankful we can be that God created what He did, how He did, and why He did. It's wonderful. I think this description frightens us because we recognize a complete absence of everything we need to live. That's the problem. Nothing that we need to live is there. And so it's frightening. Such a place might be able to sustain some form of life, but certainly not ours. It's a place not suited for us, in which we may not dwell. And for that reason, it seems almost hostile to us. But think of this, not so to God. God didn't come down on the face of the waters and think, man, I don't know if I'm going to make it down there. Hold my breath, I'm going in. I mean, it wasn't like that. You couldn't survive in this kind of a situation. But not so for God. It poses no challenge to God, no threat to God. Nothing does. It's not a risky proposition for God to draw near to the face of the waters, to enter into the darkness. But it would be for any created thing. It's absolutely safe for God. He's sovereign, He's capable, He's calm, He just draws near. Again, it's a cause to be thankful for what God has done. There was no need in God to do anything more than what He already did. But He came and He did, this is what He's done. He's made what we see. The Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. This last phrase, the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. The Spirit of God. I've already told you in weeks past that the word for God, Elohim, is sometimes used as a superlative to talk about something great and grand and magnificent. And there's some people who say it should be used that way here. The word for spirit, you're probably already familiar with, both in the Hebrew and in the Greek, is the same word used for breath or wind, right? Or can be used in that way. And so there's some people who say, you know, that all of this is a description of the earth before God began to speak. It was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and there was this mighty wind blowing through there, and it was just a mess. And part of that kind of fits, like, okay, maybe. The problem with that is that these two words put together always only exclusively mean Spirit of God. Always. In terms of taking, and that's what it means when they're together all the time. But if I were just to say, well, maybe they can be together and mean something besides just the Spirit of God, what else could it mean? Well, if we were to look at the textual evidence and just look at this verse, if I'm going to take God as a description and say, well, it just means mighty, the problem with that is in this entire chapter, every time that word is used, it always is a reference to God. And so you would have then this, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And a mighty wind, same word, mighty wind, was hovering over the face of the waters. Does wind hover over the face of the waters? Does wind brood over the face of the waters? And then the next verse, and God said. So it's like you've got God in the verse before and in the verse after. How would you ever get the idea that now we're not talking about the Spirit of God, that it's a mighty wind? When everything in the chapter says you take Elohim as God, not as a superlative, and the phrase when put together, when the two words are put together, it always means Spirit of God. Some guys say, they want to say, well, it was the wind of God. And when they say that, I'm sympathetic. I disagree with them, but I'm sympathetic in that they don't mean to take the Spirit of God out of it. They mean to say that the wind of God was moving upon the face of the waters as a concrete manifestation of the Spirit of God. I don't know why. I mean, it just seems like, why say that when it means Spirit of God? Like, why? I don't know if it's the imagery that they have of when you think of God's Spirit moving upon the face of the waters, He'd be stirring them up, and that seems like, oh, well, yeah, it could be a wind. The wind of God came. But it's just really unnecessary. And there are some texts in the Old Testament where the Spirit of God is associated with a mighty wind. There's some in the New Testament. And so I get the connection. It's just unnecessary because the phrase always means Spirit of God. So I don't hold that. But let me look further at some of this argument for Spirit of God, and we'll look at what was happening here. This strong wind, if we take that interpretation, is said to be hovering or brooding over the face of the waters. But strong winds don't hover and brood. Birds hover and brood. And that's the imagery. This hovering or brooding word. Let me if you want to turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 32, you'll see another place where it's used. One of the only other places it's used in the Bible. Deuteronomy 32, verse 11. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them on its pinions. Verse 12, the Lord alone guided him. No foreign God was with him. And it goes on. So here, the idea is one of either brooding over your young to provide for them with a special and intensive care, or of fluttering over them to stir them to the action you wish them to perform. Eagles they both nurture and carry over and brood over their young, but they also come and when it's time for the eagles to get out of the nest, you've heard them say they've been kicked out of the nest. Well, they don't kick them out of the nest. They take their wings and beat them, basically, and scare them to get out and go. And the word it sounds strange, but we're not sure quite which one it means. It's kind of used both ways in places. And so it has to do with this intense care, but it's not just sitting on the eggs. It has to do with, it's more active. It creates an action. And so it might be, like it's used here for the eagles, even sometimes almost a violent kind of it's caring, but it's violent in its action because it means to stir someone up to action. It's like sometimes we get the kids out of bed. Sometimes we come in and very gentle and quiet, and other times, hey, let's go, it's time to get up. And it's more violent. It's not violent, but it's more violent, you understand. So this is what we mean. So you wouldn't look at that mama eagle and say she's so mean and violent with her children, and yet you could describe it as a much more violent kind of activity. And so which is it? Well, I would say, I don't really want to have to choose. I would say probably both of these ideas kind of fit well with the description of God's activity here. The King James Version says it this way: the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. It acted upon it. It moved upon the face of the waters. And moved, that's a pretty good translation, except just the verb tense is wrong. It's not moved past tense. It's the Spirit of God was moving upon the face of the waters, was acting upon, was brooding over, was hovering over, was fluttering over. Somehow there's an activity that's done upon the face of the waters. The Spirit of God was moving upon the face of the waters. He was moving, hovering, brooding, fluttering. Now, what is all of this telling us then about what was happening at this time? Because we all agree the Spirit of God does not have wings to flutter. And He doesn't hover over anything. And there's a sense in which with God's omnipresence, even to talk about a manifestation of God is kind of a manner of speaking. It has to do with more of our perception than anything that God actually kind of is or does. It's not a description of God in His essence, but rather God in His activity, and us in our perception. Well, all of this, I think, tells us several things. And let me just kind of move through that. They build one to the next. First, it speaks to us of the basic activity of God the Spirit. We'll look at this a little bit more next time when we consider the topic of Genesis 1 and the Trinity. But just to say this, for now, suffice it to say that we're told here of the activity of God the Spirit. One thing it tells us is that the Spirit of God was moving and was active and was doing things. That's one thing it says. Second, it speaks to us of the care that God has for His creation and of the nearness He intends to His creation. The care that He has for His creation and the nearness that He intends to have to it. He did not speak and command from far off. Now I know we read the rest of Genesis, and God said, and God said, and God said. But prior to all that, you're not supposed to have in your thinking, most of it, I typically read Genesis 1 this way, as though there's nothing out there, and then there's this voice that kind of booms from behind me somewhere, and God is speaking this stuff into existence, and I watch. What I'm supposed to think of is there's just nothing out there, and all of a sudden you sense God come, and He's there, He's present, and then He speaks, and you don't see Him, but you see the light comes, and you see all this mass, and then He speaks again, and all this is happening. But where is God in all this? Well, the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. He's right there. He drew near. He literally drew near to the earthly realm, stirring and brooding over it in anticipation of His will and command. Now, it's not immediately clear what that means. What do you mean He came, that God drew near, that the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters? And we could theologize and debate about this for a long time, debating back and forth. But regardless of what we say it means and how it looked, and we can just guess is all we can do, regardless of that, I cannot escape the clear implication that the text is meant to convey a nearness of some kind. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. It's right there. God comes to and visits, in some sense, you might say, this earthly realm to work. That's the picture. A direct and an interested interaction with matter, as it was in this formless and empty state. A direct and interested interaction. God drew near to the earthly realm, stirring and brooding over it in anticipation of His will and command. And that leads us then to our next truth gleaned from this passage. It speaks to us of a preparatory work, a work of preparation. Before the first action and command of God on creation week, day 1, before He speaks the command, let there be light, God had already created the heavenly and the earthly realms. As the earth is in this disordered and barren state, God begins to act upon that earthly realm with special, intense care, preparing what was there to respond to His sovereign will of command. It speaks to us of preparation. Again, how exactly would that have looked to an observer? Well, we don't know. We don't know, and we're not told. What changes, if any, were happening to the formless and empty mass as God was hovering over it and before He spoke light into existence? Well, that cannot be known. The hidden things belong to God. The revealed things belong to us. He's not told us. But it is told to us that the Spirit of God was brooding over the waters. It speaks to us of nearness, of involvement, of care, of intentionality, and of preparation. And preparation then leads us to the final point of the message today. Namely, the passage speaks to us of the wisdom of God in all His action. There's a preparing work that He does to the creation. Right now we know, matter of theology, that God had a plan before everything started. But here you see Him acting that plan and even preparing things. It's like we have in the Proverbs. Look, when you got work to do in the field, get all your tools out there together first and then begin your work. And here's God, and He comes and He gets it all ready and set up, and then He speaks. And we see in verse 2 this kind of the preparing work, which means there's wisdom here. There's wisdom. Which is where some of these texts in the Bible come from that tell us that wisdom was the first of God's creation. And without it, He didn't do anything else. Let's look at that. Proverbs chapter 8, verse 22. I just have a series of texts I want us to look at as we consider this truth. Proverbs chapter 8 and verse 22. And we're saying here that there is a wisdom of God, not only in all that He does, but particularly in creation. Proverbs 8:22. The Lord possessed me, this is wisdom speaking, possessed me at the beginning of His work, the first of His acts of old. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills I was brought forth, before He had made the earth with its fields, or the first of the dust of the world. When He established the heavens, I was there. When He drew a circle on the face of the deep, when He made firm the skies above, when He established the fountains of the deep, when He assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress His command, when He marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside Him, like a master workman. I was daily His delight, rejoicing before Him always, rejoicing in His inhabited world, and delighting in the children of man. Wisdom. You see? And do you also notice in this text how the things that are exalted about God, the things that He did by wisdom, is that He formed everything and then He made His inhabited world? You see here again the forming and the filling, both exalted in by wisdom personified as she speaks to us about her past resume, urging us to consult her with our daily needs and come to God to seek wisdom. Verse 32, and now, O sons, listen to me. Blessed are those who keep my ways. I mean, I was God's craftsman when He made all this stuff. I was working with Him. He delighted in me. Hear instruction and be wise. Don't neglect it. Blessed is the one who listens to me. Watching daily at my gates, waiting beside my doors. For whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. But he who fails to find me injures himself, and all who hate me love death. Wisdom's crying out, but part of its resume by which it commends itself to you is the manner in which it worked with God as God was doing these things. Wisdom is the first of God's creations in this sense, if you personify it. Now, it's an attribute of God. We say God is infinitely wise, and He acted in a wise way. In this proverb, it's personified to say, look, it's calling out to you, and really the reality is God's inviting you to seek His wisdom and to live in His world that He made according to His laws and His ways and His precepts. And if you do that, you'll find life and favor from God. Not that things will be easy for you, but you'll find God's favor. A couple other texts that would speak to us about the wisdom of God in making everything, that there's a plan ahead of time, that He's preparing things. Isaiah 46, we could turn to lots, but Isaiah 46 verses 8 through 10. Remember this and stand firm. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is no other. I am God, there's none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. Now that's a text that can be broad. There's a specific application to that text in Isaiah that has to do with coming judgment. But God invokes kind of that He is this kind of God. He declares the end from the beginning. He declares from of old even things that have not yet happened. And this is the way it is. God had this plan. He knew what He wanted to do. He began to prepare this earthly realm for what He was going to say and do. I'll just maybe read two of these. I've got four texts on this next one. Before this phrase, before the foundations of the world, you have again and again in the New Testament. Let me just read two texts where it's found, just as an encouraging truth as well. Ephesians 1:4, that we were that God chose us in Him that is in Christ before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before Him. What a thing. In love, He predestined us for adoption through Jesus Christ according to the purpose of His will. So God had a will, and He purposed to do it. And even before the foundations of the world, He chose not only that He was going to have this vague will that He was going to do, but He chose specific people who would come to pass and live on this world, and He chose them in His Son to come to salvation. This was God's choice from before the foundation of the world. And it just speaks again to the intense wisdom of God, the incredible wisdom of God when He creates. Revelation 13 and verse 8, and all who dwell on the earth will, let me make sure here, will worship it, that is this image of the beast. Everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that was slain. Now think of that. The way this, how firmly, there's some of these views of God, if you've heard maybe some process theology or open theology about God. God's kind of open to various different possibilities and He's kind of going, dealing with things as they come. But here you have, individual names written in a book before the foundation of the world. How long ago was that? Well, we're not exactly sure. But back then, God wrote names in a book. And then at the end of history, the way it works out is, yep, that's right. All the names written there are the ones that are supposed to get in, and all the names not written there are the ones that are not. Everything perfectly according to plan. The wisdom of God. I can't even plan shelves in Adam's garage without a hang-up. It's in the wisdom of God. And Adam's not to say because he knows exactly the hang-up I'm talking about. Just the sheer wisdom of God. Plan your work your plan, you've heard it said. That's what God's doing. He planned His work. He's working the plan. And it's working perfectly according to plan. Now let's get a little bit more specific. And just two very familiar texts to us. One in Psalms, one in Jeremiah. Psalm 139. Psalm 139. Verses 13 to 16. Right? We always hear these texts when in the abortion debate. Or I shouldn't even call it a debate. What's debatable about it? The abortion issue. How about that? We hear this again and again. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as of yet there were none of them. We often, if we think of God having a plan ahead of time, we think of it in terms of just big picture. We don't think of it of ourselves personally. Then sometimes we do think of it of ourselves personally, and that's an encouraging truth. But then we don't very often think of it as in terms of what He created back then, of God, the same way that God kind of came and knew you intimately, personally, and was forming you together in the secret place when no one else was around, when it was all in darkness and nothing could be seen but to God alone. He was doing the same thing to creation itself, to the earthly realm, when it was just enveloped in darkness. It was totally formless. There was nothing there. There was no light. There was no witness. It was just God speaking, not God speaking, but God working, hovering, brooding over the face of the waters. Doing what? We don't know. Brooding, caring for it, working it up somehow, preparing. And if that picture has struck you with just a unique kind of glory and activity of God that you've not seen before, this text ought to say, look, yeah, and that kind of thing, the power of God at work to prepare what He wanted, to bring it to pass perfectly. God was doing that for every human being that lives, forming them, knowing them, preparing them, writing out all their days before any of them were. And He knows us intimately. Or Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 5. Jeremiah 1:5. Certainly Jeremiah was unique in that he was a prophet, specifically used by God for a certain purpose. The reality is every person is used by God for a certain purpose. Jeremiah 1 verses 4 and 5. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Jeremiah, whatever his calling was to be, the highest aim for which God was going to use him, the way he was going to live and the way he was going to die, the things he was going to do yet in the future in his life that he didn't yet know when he was growing up, God appointed him ahead of time for that purpose and called him by that name and said, this is what you'll be. Just like God says in Genesis 1, let there be light. Just, He creates it, He makes it, and His Word stands fast. Well, again, so that's the content of what I have for today, and I just would say, I hope this encourages you in your walk with God, this image of God doing what He's doing in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. It's just encouraging me to when I just even try to picture, and maybe you picture it differently, but however I picture it, it's an encouraging thing to think about God doing this kind of thing and acting in this way, preparing ahead of time, coming near to work tenderly, deliberately, thoughtfully, carefully. Before He even sets out the first actions, He does this. And it's this way with God. He's a careful planner of everything that He does. The things that come into your life, they don't just kind of come in randomly and then God makes the best of it. Or it's not just that in an unfeeling way, God has this plan for your life and you just need to make peace with it. We sang it today. He has my interest. He takes up my cause. Now we think of it when you become a Christian, you take up Christ's cause. And you do. But the reality is a loving God takes up your cause and works and labors for you and cares for you and prepares all of this for your good. He designs to bless you. And everything that comes into life, it comes in not just through the filter of God's kind of general providence, but through the filter of His tender, deliberate will. This kind of care that He exercises. And He does it over everything. There's anything you might think He could just kind of show up haphazardly and just do whatever. You'd think it would be, well, the thing's a formless mess now. Do whatever. You're not going to mess it up, whatever you do. But He doesn't. He comes in and carefully draws near and begins to prepare for His activity. I just find that a very helpful picture of the way God works. And hopefully it's encouraging to you too. Anyway, are there questions or comments on this text and this picture of God that we've looked at?